We are taught to see the gunslinger as the ultimate threat on the frontier. A man standing alone in the street, hand hovering over the grip of a Colt, eyes narrowed against the dust and the sun. It is a clean image, a simple one. Violence reduced to a moment, a sound, and then silence. But the deadliest enemy did not carry a revolver. It did not announce itself at high noon. It lived in the water they drank, the air they shared, and the very blankets they wrapped around themselves at night. It arrived quietly. A single sneeze in a sod house, a cough in the corner of a line shack, a man clearing his throat beside a fire that was already struggling to stay alive. In the 1880s, this was not an inconvenience. It was a warning bell, a small, almost forgettable sound that could mark the beginning of something slow, something relentless, and something very difficult to stop. Because on the frontier, a cold was never just a cold. It was the first crack, and what followed would seep through it. The West, as it is often imagined, is a place of clean air and open horizons, a land where hardship forged strength, where men grew tougher simply by breathing the wind that swept across the plains. It is a comforting idea that nature itself hardened the body, that exposure built resilience. The truth is far less forgiving. The frontier did not strengthen the body, it wore it down. Day after day, men and women lived under a sky that offered no protection. The wind did not stop. It cut through clothing, through skin, through whatever strength a person believed they had. Rain turned ground to mud, then froze it into something harder than stone. Summer brought heat that baked the lungs dry, filling each breath with dust that clung and lingered. There was no balance, only extremes, and the body, already strained, had very little left to give. Food was not nourishment, it was survival. Salt pork, hard and greasy, beans, boiled until they softened just enough to swallow. Coffee, black and bitter, often replacing water that could not be trusted. Hardtack, dense and unyielding, sometimes crawling with weevils that were brushed away rather than removed. Fresh vegetables were rare, fruit rarer still. There were no vitamins, no understanding of what the body lacked, only the slow, quiet symptoms of deficiency. Gums that bled, skin that cracked, limbs that weakened without explanation. Scurvy did not announce itself loudly. It crept in, and once it settled, it stayed. Men worked through it. They worked through everything. Long days in the saddle, longer nights in the cold. Sleep came when it could, often on the ground, wrapped in blankets that had seen too many seasons and too many owners. Those blankets were not clean. They could not be. They carried sweat, dirt, parasites, the lingering traces of the last man who used them, and still, they were all that stood between a body and the cold. By the time a man lay down at night, he was already exhausted, not just tired, but worn thin in a way that sleep alone could not repair. This was the reality of the healthy outdoor life, and into that reality, something as small as a cold could take root. It began simply: a dryness in the throat, a slight irritation, a cough that could be ignored. At first, the body, already weakened, struggled to respond. There were no reserves, no strength to spare. What should have been a minor inconvenience found no resistance. It settled deeper, moving from the nose to the chest, from irritation to infection. And then it changed. The cough lingered. It deepened. It became heavier, wetter. Breathing grew more difficult, each inhale a conscious effort rather than an instinct. This was where the danger truly began, because on the frontier there was no line between a cold and something far worse. No clear moment where one ended and the other began. Only a gradual descent, bronchitis, pneumonia, or something slower, something quieter, something that did not kill quickly but made sure it did not need to. Consumption. It was known by many names, but they all described the same process. The body being slowly eaten from within. The lungs, once capable of drawing in the vast air of the plains, reduced to fragile, failing tissue. At first, it looked like nothing. A lingering cough, A man who tired more easily than before. A slight loss of weight that could be blamed on hard work and poor rations. But it did not stop. The cough became constant. Dry at first, then deeper, harsher. It tore at the chest, leaving pain that did not fade. Nights brought no relief. Instead, they brought sweat. Thick, drenching sweat that soaked through clothing and blankets alike, leaving the body chilled as the air settled in. Sleep became fragmented, shallow, unrestful. Then came the blood. Not all at once, not dramatically, just small traces at first. A stain in a handkerchief, a hint of red where there should have been none. It was easy to ignore, until it wasn't. The body wasted. Slowly, visibly, muscle faded, fat disappeared. The face sharpened, cheekbones pushing against skin that no longer had the strength to hold its shape. Eyes sank deeper, becoming brighter in a way that was not healthy, not natural. A kind of hollow clarity. Breathing became labor. Each inhale shallow, each exhale strained. The lungs no longer expanded fully. They could not. And all the while, the man remained awake, aware. There was no sudden end, only a long, drawn-out decline. This was the reality behind a simple cold. But the illness itself was only part of the story, because what came next often made it worse. Much worse. There was treatment on the frontier, if that is the word one chooses to use. Doctors existed, but they were few and often far away. Many had limited training. Some had none at all. Knowledge of disease was incomplete, uncertain. Germ theory was still finding its footing, and many did not believe in it at all. Illness was explained in other ways. Bad air, imbalance, exposure. Treatment followed those ideas. Laudanum was common, a mixture of alcohol and opium, taken to dull pain, to quiet coughing, to allow a few hours of rest. It did not cure anything. It simply made the suffering easier to endure. For a time. Patent medicines were everywhere. Bottles with labels promising relief, protection, recovery. They contained alcohol, sometimes large amounts, often mixed with narcotics. They warmed the body, numbed the senses, and created the illusion of improvement. An illusion that did not last. Other remedies were more direct, more aggressive. Mercury, calomel, substances that weakened the body further, administered in the belief that they would purge illness. Bloodletting, intended to restore balance, often left patients weaker than before. Folk treatments filled the gaps. Boiled herbs, poultices made from whatever could be found, mixtures that burned, that stung, that offered the comfort of action without the benefit of effect. In many cases, the treatment did not help. In some, it hastened the end. And still, it was all they had. But even if a man survived the illness itself, there was another problem. He was not alone. The frontier was not empty. It was crowded in ways that mattered. Sod houses held entire families in single rooms, walls thick with earth but poor at keeping out the cold. Air did not move freely. It lingered. Stale, heavy, shared. A cough in one corner reached every other corner. Line shacks and bunkhouses were worse. Men slept close together, their bedrolls nearly touching. There was no space to isolate, no understanding that isolation was needed. One man became ill, then another, then all of them. Stagecoaches carried passengers for days at a time, packed tightly, breathing the same air, touching the same surfaces. There was no separation, no pause. The journey continued, regardless of who fell ill along the way. At stops, water was shared. Basins passed from hand to hand. Towels used by one, then another again. Cleanliness was a luxury. Time did not allow for it. In saloons, the problem spread further. Glasses reused, surfaces wiped with cloths that had already absorbed more than they removed. Men gathered close, talking, laughing, coughing, and then they returned to their homes, carrying something with them. The disease did not stay in one place. It moved, quietly, efficiently, but even then, there was still a chance. A small one. Recovery required rest, warmth, time. The frontier offered very little of any of those. Winter was not simply cold, it was invasive. It found every weakness in a structure, every gap in a wall, every thin point in a blanket. Fires burned when there was fuel. When there wasn't, the cold returned immediately, relentlessly. Children woke with frost forming at the edges of their noses, breath visible even indoors, water freezing where it stood. Adults endured the same. Clothing stayed on at night because removing it risked losing what little warmth remained. Sleep came in short intervals, broken by shivering, by coughing, by the constant need to adjust against a cold that did not ease. For the sick, this was devastating. The body needed warmth to heal. It needed stability. Instead, it faced constant stress. Each breath of cold air irritated already inflamed lungs. Each night without proper rest slowed recovery further. And so the illness lingered, deepened. What might have passed in a few days stretched into weeks, then months. And for many, it never passed at all. But the cold was only the beginning. The environment made sure it never truly ended. And in that slow, grinding way, the frontier claimed its dead. Not with violence, not with spectacle, but with quiet persistence. Men did not always collapse in the street. They did not always die in moments that could be remembered clearly. More often, they faded, a little each day, a little each night, until there was nothing left to fade. The land kept its record, not in names, but in absence. Graves without markers, mounds of earth that settled over time until they became part of the landscape itself. No stories attached, no legends, just the knowledge that someone had been there. And then they were not. The sound itself was unremarkable. A cough, half suppressed into a sleeve. A rasp of breath drawn a little too sharply. The kind of noise that would barely register in any other place, at any other time. But here, in a low-roofed sod house with walls pressed from earth and roots, it carried. It lingered in the still air, mixing with the smell of damp soil, animal fat, and unwashed wool. There were no windows open to draw it away, no breeze to dilute it. It stayed, and everyone inside breathed it in. That was the nature of illness on the frontier. It did not need drama, it did not need chaos, it only needed proximity, and there was always proximity. A family of 6 might sleep in a single room, their bedrolls laid side by side on a dirt floor that hardened in winter and softened to mud in spring. Children curled close to their parents, sharing blankets that had been patched and repatched until they barely held together. Every movement stirred the air. Every breath was shared. If one child fell ill, the others followed. Not immediately, not all at once, but inevitably. The first night brought a cough. The second, a fever. By the third, the sound of breathing itself had changed, becoming heavier, uneven. The house, already small, seemed to close in further as the illness settled into each occupant. There was nowhere to go. Isolation was not an option, and even if it had been, it would not have mattered. Because the sickness did not remain contained within walls. It traveled, from house to house, from camp to camp, along the same routes that carried supplies, letters, and people. A wagon train moving west did not just bring hope and ambition, it carried disease, quietly threaded through its ranks. One person fell ill along the trail, then another, and another. The wagons did not stop for long, they could not. Time, distance, and dwindling resources demanded movement. So the sick traveled with the healthy, lying beneath canvas covers, coughing into blankets, breathing into the confined space of the wagon interior. The disease moved with them. At river crossings, at rest stops, at the brief moments where travelers gathered together, it spread further. A shared cup of water passed between hands, a piece of cloth used to wipe a face, then handed on. A handshake, a steadying grip, a simple act of assistance. Each one carried risk, and risk, on the frontier, rarely stayed contained. But even beyond the wagons, beyond the homes and the trails, there were places where illness thrived more efficiently than anywhere else. The saloon. It was warm, or at least warmer than outside. That alone was enough to draw men in. The doors opened and closed constantly, letting in gusts of cold air that swirled through the smoke and the heat of bodies gathered too close together. Glasses were filled, emptied, and filled again, rarely washed properly, wiped perhaps with a cloth that had already seen too much use. Men drank, they laughed, they coughed, and no one thought much of it. A man with a cold was not unusual. It was expected, almost routine. He would lean against the bar, hand wrapped around a drink, coughing into his fist before taking another sip. The alcohol burned his throat, dulled the irritation for a moment. Then it returned, stronger, and the men around him did the same. They coughed, they wiped their mouths, they reached for the same surfaces, the same glasses, the same shared spaces. Illness did not need to force its way in. It was welcomed, unknowingly, and when those men left, they carried it with them. Back to bunkhouses, back to line camps, back to the same close quarters where the air never quite moved enough. There, in the quiet after the noise, the real work of the disease began. Because once it settled into the lungs, once it moved beyond the surface irritation of a cold, it became something far more difficult to escape. Pneumonia did not arrive with warning. It built slowly, layering itself over an already weakened body. The cough deepened. The chest tightened. Breathing became labored, each inhale accompanied by a faint crackle, a subtle resistance that grew more pronounced with time. Fever followed, not the kind that came and went, but one that stayed. It burned steadily, draining what little strength remained. The skin flushed, then paled. Sweat soaked through clothing, leaving the body chilled as soon as it dried. And still, the coughing did not stop. It became constant, relentless, each fit of it tearing at the chest, leaving the throat raw, the lungs aching. Sleep, when it came, was shallow and broken. The body could not rest. It could only endure. And for many, endurance was not enough, because without proper care, without warmth, without the basic conditions needed to recover, pneumonia did what it had always done. It finished what the cold had started. But even that was not always the end. Because for some, the illness took a different path. Slower, more deliberate. Consumption did not rush. It lingered. A man might survive the worst of a winter illness, believing himself fortunate. The fever would break. The cough would lessen, just enough to give the illusion of recovery. He would return to work, return to the routine. But something would remain, a weakness that could not be shaken, a cough that never fully disappeared, a fatigue that settled deeper than before, as though the body had lost something it could not regain. Weeks would pass, then months. The weight would begin to drop, not dramatically at first, just enough to be noticed in the way clothes hung a little looser, in the way a belt needed tightening by another notch. It could be explained away. Hard work, poor diet, but it did not stop. The face grew thinner, the eyes more pronounced. The skin took on a pallor that no amount of rest could correct. And then the coughing changed. It became harsher, deeper. It lingered longer after each fit, leaving the man bent forward, catching his breath in short, shallow pulls. Blood would appear again, more than before, and this time it would not go away. Consumption was not sudden. It was a process of erosion. The body, piece by piece, losing its ability to sustain itself. The lungs, once strong enough to endure the dust and cold of the frontier, began to fail. Small sections of tissue broke down, leaving cavities where air should have moved freely. Breathing became inefficient, then painful, then almost impossible. The man remained conscious throughout it all, aware of the decline, aware that there was very little to be done. He would try to continue, to work, to function, to maintain some semblance of normal life. But the body had already begun to withdraw its support. Eventually, even standing became difficult. Then walking, then simply sitting upright. And at the end, it came down to breathing. Just breathing. each inhale drawn with effort, each exhale a quiet release that did not bring relief. The body grew lighter as it wasted, but the air felt heavier, as though it no longer wished to enter. And, in the end, it didn't. And in many cases, that cough did not end with the man who carried it. It moved on, quietly, unnoticed at first, then unavoidable. A wife, tending to her husband, would sit close, listening to his breathing, counting the pauses between each strained inhale. She would wipe his brow, adjust the blanket, bring water when she could. In doing so, she placed herself within reach of the same invisible threat. Days later, she would begin to cough. A child, too young to understand, would curl beside a sick parent for warmth. The same warmth that carried infection from one body to another. The same breath shared in the dark. There was no separation between care and exposure. They were the same thing, and so the illness spread not just through towns and camps, but through families, through the smallest, most intimate spaces where survival depended on closeness. It was not reckless, it was necessary, and it was fatal, because the frontier did not provide alternatives. There were no hospitals waiting over the next hill, no clean wards, no sterile instruments, no understanding of isolation as a tool for survival, only distance. And distance, more often than not, made things worse. A man who fell ill miles from the nearest settlement did not have the luxury of remaining still. He had to move, even when movement became painful. He had to ride, even when his lungs burned with every breath. He had to push forward because stopping meant something even more immediate than illness. It meant exposure. It meant starvation. It meant being left behind. So he moved. And in moving, he carried the sickness further. From one camp to the next, from one group to another, a chain reaction stretching across miles of open land, invisible and unstoppable. But even those who stayed behind were not safe, because the structures meant to protect them were never truly sealed. Sod houses, built from the earth itself, were practical but flawed. The walls held warmth poorly. The roofs leaked. The floors, often nothing more than packed dirt, became breeding grounds for insects and moisture. The air inside grew thick, stale, heavy with the presence of those living within it. And when illness entered that space, it did not dissipate. It concentrated. Each cough added to it. Each breath carried it further. And over time, it became something more than just a passing sickness. It became part of the environment. The same was true in mining towns, where men descended into narrow shafts, breathing dust-laden air for hours at a time. Their lungs, already strained, already compromised. When they returned to the surface, they carried that strain with them. A cold, in such conditions, did not remain confined to the upper airways. It descended, settled, and found fertile ground. Miners, already coughing from dust, found their symptoms worsening. The line between irritation and infection blurred. What might have been dismissed as the result of labor became something far more serious, and by the time it was recognized, it was too late. Because recognition did not bring solutions. It only brought awareness, and awareness, without the means to act, changes very little. This was the true isolation of the frontier. Not just physical distance, but medical distance. The knowledge that something was wrong paired with the inability to correct it. A man might know he was dying. He might feel it in the weakness of his limbs, in the shallow nature of his breathing, in the way his body no longer responded as it once had. But knowing did not stop the process. It only made it more real and more difficult to endure. There were moments of hope, brief ones, a day where the fever seemed to break, a morning where breathing felt easier, a stretch of hours where the coughing lessened, allowing the body to rest. These moments were clung to. They had to be, because without them, there was nothing. But they did not last. The illness returned, often stronger than before, as though it had merely paused to gather strength, and each return took more from the body, until there was very little left to take. At that point, the end was not dramatic. It was quiet. A man would lie still, too weak to move, too exhausted to speak. Those around him would watch, listening to each breath, aware that they were counting down without knowing the exact number. There was no doctor to call, no medicine to administer that would change the outcome. Only presence and waiting. The final breaths were often shallow, spaced further apart with each passing minute. The body, having fought for as long as it could, simply stopped. Not abruptly, but gently, as though it had reached a point where continuation was no longer possible. And then there was silence. Not the sudden silence of a gunshot ending, but a gradual one. The absence of sound where there had once been struggle. And in that silence, the reality of the frontier revealed itself most clearly. Because there was no spectacle, no audience, no legend, just a body, a blanket, and the understanding that another life had been claimed by something that could not be seen, could not be fought in the way stories often prefer. The burial was simple. It had to be. Time and resources did not allow for anything more. A shallow grave, dug as best as the ground would allow. In winter, this could take hours. The earth hardened to the point where each strike of a tool felt like an act of defiance against the land itself. The body was wrapped, often in the same blanket that had offered little protection in life. Placed into the ground. Covered. There might be words spoken, there might not. Then the living moved on, because they had to. The frontier did not pause for grief. And yet, the land remembered. Not in the way we do, with names and markers and stories carefully preserved, but in numbers, in the sheer volume of those who did not survive. Along the great trails that stretched westward, the evidence remained, not always visible, but present. Beneath the soil, scattered across miles of terrain, lay the remains of those who had set out with intention and hope, only to be undone by something as small as a microorganism. Something they could not see, something they could not understand, something they could not stop. We return, again, to the image we began with. The gunslinger, the quick draw, the moment of violence that defines so much of how the West is remembered. It is not entirely false, but it is incomplete, because the truth is slower, quieter, and far more pervasive. The deadliest enemy did not stand in the street. It sat beside you at the fire, it shared your drink, it traveled with you in the wagon, it lay beside you in the dark, and when it came, it did not end things quickly. It took its time. A simple cold was often the beginning, a small irritation, a passing discomfort, but on the frontier that was enough, because once it took hold, there was very little to stop it. And so, far from the myths and the gunfights, far from the stories that are easy to tell, countless lives ended not in violence, but in quiet struggle, in bedrolls, in sod houses, in lined shacks where the wind never truly stopped, struggling to breathe, until eventually they couldn't, and no one wrote their names down.